One of the best investments of my life was when I purchased a washing machine and dryer for my house so I didn't have to go down to the laundromat anymore. I mean, they turned out to literally be life-saving. When I first got them installed in my house, I had them placed in the basement because that was where the hookup happened to be. And at first, it was really annoying to go up and down the stairs with a full hamper, but I came to appreciate them being in the basement when I was throwing a load in late one night and heard something strange on the first floor above me. As I closed up the door to the washing machine, I at first thought that I had somehow broken it because it was almost right as it clicked shut that I heard the sound of glass smashing. But after hearing the sound of footsteps above me, I realized that someone had broken into my house. Now, I lived in a relatively nice two-bedroom house, but the neighborhood that it was in was sort of shady. So I had security cameras installed just in case something like this happened. And at first, I wondered why my phone didn't notify me about someone triggering the cameras, but that was when I realized that I was an idiot and had left my phone charging on my nightstand. I could hear the sound of someone who sounded like they were running around upstairs, almost like they were looking for me. It sounded like they were running from room to room as I quickly began looking around in my basement for a place to hide. My heart began to race as I started to hear whoever it was yelling from upstairs. I could hear them screaming out, "Where are you?" I had never been more afraid in my entire life, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out why they were there. All I knew was that I had to hide. As I continued to look around frantically for a good place to conceal myself so that the intruder wouldn't find me, I realized there was just enough space behind the washer and dryer for me to stash myself. So I quickly wedged myself as far back into the corner behind the washing machine as I could and stacked some empty boxes that were already next to the dryer over the top and sides of me. And I'm glad I did, because just as I finished getting settled, I heard the sound of the basement door being opened, followed by the intruder running down the stairs. They continued to yell as they looked around the room for me, and my heart began to race as I heard their footsteps approaching the washing machine. They stopped right at the edge of the boxes that I had used to hide and began moving them. To this day, I'm still not sure how he didn't notice me, but through a small crack in the boxes, I could see the intruder clear as day. Right away, I recognized him. It was the friend of a coworker who had gone out drinking with us a few nights before. He kept telling me how nice my car was, and how appreciative he was that I was paying for all of his drinks. I guess he thought since I had saved up a little bit of money for myself that I was the perfect person to rob. Thankfully, he never ended up finding me, and after about 30 minutes of looking around, he ended up leaving my house. As soon as I knew it was clear, I called the police and filed the report. They were able to arrest him within a few days, and they even found some of the things he took from my house and his apartment, like my PlayStation and my camera equipment. Ever since then, I've definitely been wary about how I present myself to strangers. I don't want anyone thinking they can just break into my house again. When I was a kid, I grew up in our big house in Texas, and I loved every second of it. Not only did we have land for miles to go hiking and hang out with our friends, but we also had a ton of room, so we always had guests over. It was a really nice childhood, and honestly, the only part about that house that I don't miss whatsoever was the basement. I hated that basement ever since I can remember, and I don't think I'll ever forget the day that the uneasy feeling that it caused me was justified. For years, my older sister and I had been complaining to our parents about the fact that we could hear noises coming from down there in the middle of the night, and every time we told them about it, they just assumed that we were being young and imaginative. That was until one day when my dad and I were working on putting a new wall up in one of the spare rooms that we were remodeling. It was then when it was just my father and me in the basement. Every time it happened, it sounded like a quick tapping, moving from one side of the room to the other, as if someone was running across the room, but trying to be quiet about it. As soon as my dad heard the noise, he shot up to his feet and told me to hang tight as he went to check it out. That was the longest 5 minutes of my life. When he came back upstairs, he told me that he couldn't find anything and brushed the noise off as the house just settling, although I knew that even he didn't believe that was true. Over the next couple of weeks, any time that I heard that noise, I yelled to my dad about it, but after the first few times, he stopped going to check it out, a decision that he would later regret. I wasn't willing to let it go though. And eventually, I managed to gather up some courage. I prepared myself because the next time I heard that sound, I was going to rush down into the basement as fast as I could. Oddly enough, it was after I made that decision that the noise stopped for a little while. It was probably a good month or so before I heard the tapping sound again. But this time I was ready for it. And as soon as I started to hear it, I took off toward the basement. I pulled open the basement door and made my way down the stairs, and what I saw both confused me and freaked me out. As I made my way into the basement, I could have sworn that I saw a piece of the wall on the other end of the room shifting a little bit. At first, I thought it was just my vision playing games with me, but as I stepped further into the room, I started to hear a sound that I hadn't heard before. Coming from the other side of the wall, it was very faint, but I could hear the subtle sound of something shuffling around. I yelled up to anyone in my house who could hear me as loud as I could for them to come down to the basement, and thankfully both of my parents came running. I explained to my dad what I had heard. And right away he began pressing up against the wall, and to our surprise, one of the pieces of drywall was loose. As my dad moved it, all of us were shocked to see what looked like a small room that was about 4 feet by 4 feet behind the wall. And what was even stranger was that on the other side of the small room was what looked like a tunnel that was just big enough for someone to crawl through practically on their stomach. My dad told both me and my mom to stay in the house while he went into the backyard to see where the tunnel could have led, which turned out to be a small metal hatch behind our shed that we all had just assumed was the lid to our sewage tank. My dad opened up the hatch, and right away my mom and I could see light peeking through the tunnel. It was then that my parents realized that someone must have been sneaking into our basement for some reason. And after that, they both started looking for anything that might have gone missing. But as far as they could tell, there was nothing important that was stolen. My dad sealed up the exit to the tunnel by putting a small slab of concrete over it. And we securely placed a new piece of sheetrock on the wall in the basement. To this day, we still don't know who or why someone was sneaking into our house. My husband Jackson and I lived in a small rented house in the town where we grew up and met each other, before moving into our apartment in the city. I loved everything about that house, and moving away was definitely hard. Though considering what happened in the basement a couple of months before we moved, it definitely seemed like it was the right time. It happened on a weekend toward the end of winter. We had just gotten back from having a small date night, which was just us grabbing some food at the mall and then getting some clothes and things we needed. By the time we got home, it was around 7 p.m. and it was freezing cold. I remember almost slipping on ice that I didn't notice on the dark pathway from the driveway to our front door. It was so cold that the first thing that I did when we got inside was turn the pellet stove on to get the house warmed up for us. Much to my irritation, though, I realized that the hopper was empty and I needed to grab a bag of pellets from the basement. But when I made my way over to the door, I noticed it had been left wide open. Now, we never did that because we had a cat who liked to go into the basement and then climb up into the insulation in between the basement ceiling and the living room floor. So as soon as I saw that the door was open, I turned to ask Jackson if he had been in the basement that day, but he told me that he didn't need to, and I didn't see any reason to ask any more questions about that and just told him that I was going to check the basement for our cat, and asked him if he could check around upstairs. Thankfully, before I even made it to the bottom step, I heard Jackson call out that the cat was in our room. I quickly made my way over to the pellets and grabbed a bag before heading upstairs and making sure to shut the door behind me. Jackson and I talked about how strange it was that the door was just left open, and what was even weirder was the fact that the cat stayed out of the basement. According to my husband, when he found him, our cat was just hiding underneath our bed for some reason. I figured that she did make her way into the basement at some point and probably just did something in the insulation that freaked her out, so I didn't make a big deal out of it, but I eventually realized that she was hiding because she had always been skittish around strangers and she was onto something that Jackson and I knew nothing about, at least not until after we had a little late night snack and were getting ready for bed. It was then that I was passing by the basement door to head into the bathroom when I heard the sound of something moving around in the basement. I called Jackson over to the door and put my finger to my lips to signal for him to be quiet and listen to see if he could confirm what I was hearing, and sure enough, we both heard the sound of something moving around in the basement. At first, I thought it was probably just a raccoon or something along those lines that got in somehow, so I decided to go and check it out. But when I did, I realized that I was very wrong. I opened the door to the basement slowly, and I didn't even have to step onto the first step before I could clearly see someone's leg move around the corner of the staircase and out of sight. I quickly closed the door and told Jackson to call the police as I kept my back against the door. The man in the basement must have heard me tell him to call the cops because before he even got to the phone, the person in the basement tried to charge up the stairs and break through the door to make his escape. Keeping my whole weight on the door, I was able to contain the man in our basement until the police arrived. After that, they arrested him for breaking and entering, and even managed to connect him to 2 other break-ins that occurred earlier that day. After he faced trial, we were happy to see that he was charged and sentenced to 7 years in prison, though he'll be getting out in about 2 years as far as I know. Thankfully, we are nowhere near our old town, so there's no need for Jackson or me to keep tabs. With luck, we'll never run into that person again.